Welcome to the Cinematic Bridge Podcast, Episode 3, Exploring Hollywood with George Shaw, giving voice to vision and the power of music in film. I'm your host, Charlie Shan, and today's guest is Hollywood film and animation composer George Shaw. From DreamWorks' Abominable, The Invisible City, to a career built on heart, harmony, and storytelling. Acclaimed film composer George Shaw promises to take us inside the unseen force that brings film to life. Stay tuned to discover how music becomes emotion, how melody gives vision its voice, and how scores shape the soul of cinema. Today, we're diving deep into the emotional heartbeat of cinema, film music from animation to live action, YouTube series to global features. George has shaped the cinematic sound in ways that bring characters, worlds, and emotions to life. George, welcome. It's an honor to have you with us. And how do you feel I did doing a voiceover over your music?
Yeah, it's great. So great to be here. And music always makes it more dramatic, right?
Oh yeah, I was playing with how to do the intro, and it was much more dramatic with your
Yeah.
music. So let's start right at the beginning. How did you become a film composer?
I sort of grew up loving lots of soundtracks. I kind of grew up in the 80s and the 90s when, you know, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas were making like Star Wars and E.T., Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park. And those soundtracks just inspired my imagination. And I fell in love with movies as well as soundtracks. I distinctly remember watching Back to the Future on VHS, and um, I just loved the music in the end credits so much that I actually hooked up a tape player to the back of the VCR to record the music from the end credits, just so I could listen to it over and over again. And so I started writing my own tunes, and I was always inspired by stories and images, and realized that being a film, TV, video game composer was sort of the dream job for me. And so I went and studied at USC's film scoring program, which is generally thought of as the best for that, and kind of, came out of school scoring anything and everything that I could, from student films to little indie short films and even features. Uh, Along the way, I fell into the world of YouTube as sort of the early 2010s, when Hollywood wasn't letting Asian Americans into the industry, and so YouTube became sort of an outlet for a lot of storytellers who were of Asian descent. And
I
um,
noticed you cast yourself in the Star Wars parody.
right, yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely get into that later. But yeah, I was working with a lot of these young Asian American storytellers who were blowing up in the early days of YouTube content creation. And so I was composing music for videos that were getting millions of views, which is kind of phenomenal when you think about um, like these people who are coming from nothing and like building these immense audiences. So I was, kind of doing some of that work while always doing independent films, and just kind of building my career off of that.
Wonderful. And then you had mentioned some of the early great films. Was there a moment or influence that really set you on the path? Was it, recording the end credit music? Was it that, or was it something else?
It was a series of things. Um, I mean, my first interest in music started with one of my childhood best friends. His name is Carl. Shout out to Carl. He lives in Norway now. Um, he was playing Fear Elise by Beethoven on the piano in our elementary school music class, and I was like, oh, I want to do that. And so I wanted to take lessons just to play Beethoven. Um, and then as I entered middle school, that was when Beauty and the Beast and Jurassic Park had come out just before that, and I just loved those soundtracks. Those were the first two soundtracks I owned, and I distinctly remember getting to play Jurassic Park in middle school band, and that was a thrill. And so I started noticing these composers that are now still my two favorite composers. One is John Williams, who, I was looking at Boston Pop's recordings of his music and going, oh, he did E.T. and Indiana Jones, and I grew up with these movies, and I just love those soundtracks that just transported you to these worlds that I loved. And the other one was Alan Menken, who did obviously the Disney Renaissance of animated musicals. So he did Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Pocahontas, and that's when I just fell in love with all these soundtracks, and led to what I'm doing today.
So it sounds like you started with the piano, but it's interesting. How many instruments do you play, and do you have any favorites?
I actually don't know. My main instrument is clarinet. I also play bass clarinet, a little bit of saxophone, a bunch of world woodwind instruments, as you can see behind me if you're on video. But there's all these awesome wind instruments, particularly Chinese wind instruments like the bawu and husi. I play a little bit of percussion, obviously piano, a little bit of guitar and ukulele, and I mean, as a composer, I'm not the greatest performer in any sense. I wouldn't normally, go on stage and perform live much, but as a composer, anything that I can pick up and make noises out of, like that, to me can be an instrument. Like a recent project I did, I played a water bottle, and that was just such an interesting sound. It was this really resonant, almost like a gong, but with some liquid in it. It would make it resonant, and so that was really cool.
Great. And so being able to play many instruments, does that help you with have a style composing?
It's a great question. You know, I don't know that the instruments I have access to change my style as a composer, but they certainly broaden my palette in terms of, particularly when you're working on lower budget movies. There's no soundtrack, or I mean, there's no like budget to hire an orchestra or to hire a bunch of musicians. So, being creative and finding ways to add production value to my music is often through figuring out how to play stuff.
Okay, so at a low budget, you've got a water bottle with some water, and then a higher budget, you start adding more. But
Well, I mean, that was more of a creative decision, not necessarily a budget one.
okay, now we were talking before, and it really surprised me at what age you started playing your first instrument.
Yeah.
Do you want to-
So yeah. Well, I mean, in Asian standards, it's not that young, like 4 or 5 years old. But I actually started at 10, so that seemed kind of late. But yeah, that was the age where I started playing piano, and by the time I was 12, I was already writing music.
Oh, that's really interesting. Now, and it begs the question, what age? Okay, a lot of people listening probably have children. What age do you think should a child start playing an instrument, or is should kind of too moralistic and judgmental?
Yeah, I know. I actually agree with that. I just had a baby myself, and she's
So, are they
gotten
playing? Is your baby playing piano already?
uh, not on her, but she not on her own. But she has a toy that's like sort of a keyboard that has like 5 keys on it, and she can like kick it with her feet. So she's not like playing it, but I'm like playing melodies for her on it, and so I think it's never too early to introduce them to the idea of music, and but when they're young, it's more music appreciation than actually learning to play. Um, I'd say if a kid shows interest, like get them involved, get them lessons or instruments. So some people just start playing by ear on their own. Others need lessons to sort of understand it. I certainly did when I started out, but for me, it was my choice to get into music, and because my parents at 6 years old asked me if I wanted piano lessons. I was intimidated by all the notes on the keyboard, and I was like, no way, how could I do that? And So I'm kind of glad that I got into it on my own when I was inspired by my friend. And so to me, music was always a joy, and it was never something forced on me. So I think sometimes when you force something on someone, they're less likely to enjoy it.
I had the opposite introduction to piano. It was not a choice, and I did not end up a composer. But I did choose guitar, and I do still play. And so, does this mean you were always into classical music, or from the age of 6, basically?
Oh, I had no clue about classical music when I was younger, and certainly the sort of music that kind of worked its way into my brain was from the theme songs of cartoons and TV shows, and but I wasn't really that aware of music up until I just kind of fell into it on my own and started just buying CDs and being excited for discovering all these cool composers, and now I've I feel fortunate that I've been able to discover great music over the last few centuries.
Wonderful. You mentioned your favorite composers for film. Do you have favorite classical composers?
I mean, there's so many, um, but a few that I would say I enjoy are obviously Mozart. Um, he's a genius, and uh, Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Dvorak, Gustav Holst, Rachmaninoff are some favorites, but there's so many great works in the classical canon.
Oh, great. Okay, so let's talk about the power of music in film now. What do you think the true power of music is for film?
Music in films and media in general is it it sort of creates the underlying emotions that an image alone might not always be able to convey. And in fact, a lot of it is the unspoken moments, the moments where um I mean, obviously when you're watching a movie, like there's dialogue and things can be explained, but what when you feel is often coming from the music.
Great. And then, so does that make music essential to tell stories through film?
I mean, if you watch a movie and you mute the audio, it's not the same experience, right?
Wait,
So yeah,
yeah,
the
because,
music plays a huge role.
well, yeah, could you use the example of, Harry Potter versus James Bond? The different choices, the different feelings. You would, I guess, would you use the music to have a different experience through different series like that?
Right. So the music sets the mood, and in some cases the locale, the world. In Harry Potter, obviously, it creates the magic of the world, of all these fantastical things that you see, but the music just adds this other dimension of bringing the world to life. With James Bond, it conveys kind of through often through sort of jazzy big band kind of stuff, the sexiness of the world, as well as the stakes, the action, the suspense, all of that. So it does so much.
Great. And then, what project are you most proud of, and why? Do you have one?
Well, I would say that working for DreamWorks was a dream come true. Writing music for the animated series Abominable and the Invisible City has been a dream. In America, it's available on Hulu and Peacock. I'm not entirely sure about the rest of the world if it's even available. I think it is in certain territories. But yeah, it was a project that, I mean, first of all, I love animation, and it's such a joy to do animation because the music has to do a lot more to bring that world to life. Whereas in live action, you're grounded with real people and real places and situations that sometimes things don't need music. But with animation, you're creating an entire world from really starting from just images that are drawn. And so the music gets to create that magic. And it's a show about mythical creatures. So I always love dabbling into mythology and creating themes for all the different creatures. And on top of that, the show is set in China, and there's Chinese characters. Obviously, they're speaking English in the show, but it was just great to see people like myself being represented in the story. And I actually got really interested in Chinese music and Chinese instruments in my early 20s and started studying that. And I was so happy to get to bring that knowledge into that world because, a lot of these mythical creatures come from Chinese mythology. And so I wanted there to be a sense of culture and of their, just like the history of these characters having lived for centuries, and the Chinese instruments I used in that score, I felt like that was the perfect opportunity for that kind of storytelling.
Great. And how long does it usually take to score a film? And would things like that vary? How the length of how long it would take to score?
Usually, it's however long they give you. So, I mean, it's sort of a notorious aspect of our job is that we never get enough time. Like if we always feel we could have more time to do something even better, but we have to work within our deadlines. So I mean, I've heard of crazy projects where sometimes they hire a composer well in advance to give them plenty of time, and then 2 or 3 weeks before they finish the film, they realize, oh, this isn't working. We need to hire someone else, and they'll fire that composer, hire someone else, and they have like 2 weeks to write 2 or 3 hours of music, which is insane. Um, so it's certainly possible if you have the budget and the team to kind of pull that off. But ideally, particularly for me on like lower budget projects where it's just me writing the music and I don't have a team to kind of help facilitate that, I would particularly prefer 2 to 3 months to kind of write a feature score. Maybe even more if it's sort of like an animated film with wall to wall music and not a lot of silence in between. So yeah, it really depends, but yeah, we do it with whatever we're given.
Wonderful. And who do you collaborate more closely with? Would it be the director or the screenwriter or somebody else?
So there is a difference between film and TV. TV is known as a writer's medium. So typically the showrunners are the people who write and create the show, and then they oversee the post-production process and what composers are doing and in that collaboration. But in film, it's typically a director's medium. And so the director is the boss in charge who collaborates with us to find the sound and to bring their vision to life.
Great. And is there something that guides your musical vision, or does it come from the material or something like that?
There's so many things that can inspire me when I'm working on a project. I mean, in a way, everything inspires me and can give me reference to what I'm doing. Right? It's how does it look? How is the pacing of the edit, the cinematography, the way it's acted or directed? There's even the lighting. Like all that can inform me and like what is the mood, what is the feeling that the music needs to convey. And of course, with input from the director, uh, and it's a collaboration and a discussion of what are we doing in the scene, uh, whose point of view should the music take, is it this character or that character, um, and it just kind of comes together. Obviously, I'm a big fan of movies, so obviously the genre can inform some of that decision, and also just some of it's just sort of instinctual. Like I can't even explain why when I watch a scene I hear Latin music or something, and it's comes from just being a fan of films and listening to a lot of soundtracks and seeing how other composers have done it, and just forming my own instincts over how I approach my work.
Great. And then related to that, do you have a process for developing, let's say, the musical identity from the script to the score? I know you were mentioning where things might come from, but is there a process? Like, would you start with percussion or something like that?
For me, I love melodies, and that's what inspired me to do this in the first place. And there's so much that a melody or a theme can do with storytelling and connecting, you know, the score and the whole creating a cohesive sound to a project. Um, I mean, if you're just constantly writing something new, it's exhausting. There's nothing for the audience to kind of hold on to carry them through the journey of a story. And so I always start with themes, like writing a theme for a character or writing a theme for the theme of greed or for suspense or action adventure. You write melodies to convey what it is you want to convey in the story.
Great. And you mentioned this earlier, but how is composing for animation different from live action? Is there more freedom in one or the other?
At the end of the day, they are similar. It's still the process of figuring out what the story is and what you're trying to convey emotionally in each scene. But certainly the difference is animation requires more music to kind of bring things to life, to carry you into the world and the story. So it's just more work, really. Yeah. But it creatively, I find it's more fun because you have more room to say things with the music and animation than in live action, where sometimes the actors can convey a lot in how they say things and how they're dressed and where they're located. But yeah, it's fun to do animation just because you get to say a little bit more with the music.
And then is there an animation project that you really were challenged or inspired? You had mentioned the DreamWorks one. Is that what you would highlight again?
uh yeah, I mean, that project, it was 20 episodes of TV that are 22 minutes each, and I worked so hard on that. I was working, at times 70, 80 hours a week. It was exhausting, but it was fulfilling to get to do so much, to have, this wonderful art and stories to inspire me. So yeah, I think that was certainly a highlight of my life and career. And but there's another one that I had a lot of fun. It's only 2 minutes of music, so it was sort of a blip in my schedule. But I got to write music for Riot Games. So gamers out there who love League of Legends, that's the company that does that game, and they're one of the biggest game companies in the world. And I got to do a cinematic for them, which was, and in fact, it came right after I wrapped on Abominable, and it was a cinematic for their Lunar Revel, their sort of annual video that they put out that celebrates the Lunar New Year. And so it gave me sort of, again, another opportunity to write fantastical orchestral music with a lot of Pan Asian instrumentation to just create this awesome Asian fantasy sound.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's arguably the biggest game in the world. So that's really wonderful. You've scored a lot of genres. Do you have a favorite genre?
Well, as just a fan, I love science fiction and fantasy, and of course animation, as I've been saying. And because those are the worlds where I think melody can really make a big impact. again, it's you're creating new worlds, and so the music gets to bring that to life. And it's just so much fun. Even for me, just as a fan too. Like I love seeing new worlds and the creativity that filmmakers put into creating these worlds, and so I just love that.
Great. And now, potentially for some people, some trade secrets. Why are so many scores now recorded in Europe instead of Hollywood? Are we talking cost, creative, or cultural advantages? So much is being recorded in Europe now. Is there a secret?
Yeah, so I mean, Los Angeles has this history of recording some of the greatest soundtracks and scores of the last, century. Um, Particularly back in the days of the studio system, they actually had orchestras on staff that were there every single day, and their job was to record music for whatever movie or TV show was happening that day. Um, and so there is this history and legacy of just the best studio musicians in Los Angeles, and they amazingly can nail the music on the first take, which is an incredible skill. But also, they're so able to jump into different genres. Like you could be recording orchestral music, then they could do jazz or rock, just whatever. Like there's so much talent here. At the same time, over the last few decades, uh, the world has expanded and become more connected, and so um, there are more affordable options for recording an orchestra, which is a very expensive thing because you have to hire however many people are in the orchestra, 50, 60, 70 people. And so you have to pay that many people. You have to find a really big room to record in. So we have scoring stages here that are fantastic. But certainly there's issues with the union and the way that it can cost a lot of money to record with union musicians in LA. And so particularly on either non-union projects where the studios aren't a signatory to the union, there's obviously just lower budget and indie films and foreign films that I've worked on where the only way we could record an actual orchestra or even part of an orchestra was to go overseas. One of the popular places for big films where Star Wars and Harry Potter, James Bond, stuff like that, Mission Impossible, they've recorded in London. They have probably equally as good musicians there, and so they're sort of the other top tier place. And obviously they have some iconic scoring stages like Abbey Road, um, Air Lyndhurst, and but then there's a lot of other places where, depending on exchange rate and tax incentives and also just the cost of living, and it can be lower in those places, so their musicians charge less, and so you can actually get a bigger orchestra for less money in various parts of Europe, particularly. And there's sort of different tiers, like depending on the level of the musicians and the quality of the studios and the microphones and equipment that they have for recording. So like Eastern Europe is sometimes the lower end in terms of costs, but also a little bit less quality wise. So there's many options for different budgets and projects.
Okay, great. Do you have any favorite other? So obviously London is a favorite, but are there any other favorite countries in Europe for recording?
I mean, I've only been able to record a handful of times overseas, and in fact, so many of my projects are like for example, the DreamWorks project. There was no budget for any live musicians except for that DreamWorks project. It was I had a budget for one violin, and so I actually played a lot of instruments myself on that, and a lot of it was produced on my computer. Um, but I was able to record a album. It was actually during the pandemic, and we were originally slated to record at Abbey Road, which I was super excited for. I was going to fly out there and conduct and get to work at the studio where the Beatles recorded, and it was sort of a dream to do that. And because of their pandemic rules, there were limits on how many musicians you could have in the room. And at the time, this was like mid to late 2020. And so we ended up going to Vienna to record, and their orchestra is fantastic there as well. I mean, Vienna is like a storied city of music history, right? Like so many great musicians and composers came through there throughout the classical and romantic eras, and so yeah, I got to record there. It was remote, so I had to be in LA watching over Zoom the orchestra, which is not exciting as having all these wonderful musicians right in front of you, but it turned out great, and I was really thankful for that.
Great. And then can you tell us about some of the international films you've worked on and what might have stood out to you?
Yeah, I've done a few movies overseas. One of the earliest ones I did was a uh, Mexican supernatural horror film that was called Yokel, and it starred forgetting her name, Dee Wallace. Yeah, she was the actress who plays the mom in ET, and so she was in this movie that I worked on, Yokel again, and it was a fun movie. Not a very big budget, and it probably didn't go very far. I think you can find it on DVD somewhere. But yeah, that was almost 20 years ago that I worked on that, and it came out in theaters in Mexico. After, probably a year or two after that, I did a film in China called Sailfish, which was a really beautiful period piece about a kid who aspired to be a professional swimmer, but the Cultural Revolution happened and life became very difficult. But it was a uplifting sports movie, so that was great. More recently, about 10 years ago, I did a movie called Baby Steps, which was a co-production between Taiwan and America. And the cool thing about that was it was produced by Li Kong Shu, who produced Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And I mean, it was just, I mean, for me, that was like a great moment where my mom, whose favorite filmmaker is Ang Lee, I mean, he produced a lot of Ang Lee's early work and Crouching Tiger. And so me working with that producer kind of legitimized my career in my mom's eyes. So like that was great.
Well, Crouching Tiger is such a great example of how the material would probably influence the music. Because as soon as I think of that, I think of a certain style,
Yeah.
drama, and maybe quick movements. Now, I was wondering about technology because I've run across AI music making software.
Yeah.
And so I am very interested on what your take is on AI generated music. Is it, let's say, a helpful tool for you, or is it a threat to people who compose?
I certainly think that for some composers, and particularly the ones that are not great or mediocre, they could very well be out of a job in the future. I don't think it's quite there yet. Uh, I think what AI is sort of good at producing is more pop music, but to do the nuances of scoring stories and being able to interpret what a director says into music is a skill in itself, and it's a big part of my job. And I don't think AI can really do that. Yeah, there's so much that can happen in just one scene in a movie that to be able to like kind of follow those ups and downs in the story and to kind of go back and forth with a filmmaker and figure that out until they're happy. I don't think a filmmaker could sit there and prompt an AI into doing what they want when they don't actually know what they want. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think my job is okay. Certainly for the near future. I mean, maybe one day they can get sophisticated enough, but there's just such a human element to this that is, I don't think AI could ever replicate. So I think my job is okay. There's certain tools that I use that use AI functions. So I embrace seeing more of that where it could alleviate sort of the more tedious parts of my job and sort of automate things. But yeah, there's only so much it could do
Okay,
that
great.
is original, right?
Yeah, I look at it the same way. It's kind of like power tools and how that affected carpentry. And so maybe some of the very unskilled carpenters were out of a job. But
Yeah, I mean, I think the place where it could easily sort of replace people is music libraries, and that's where filmmakers or more typically like lower budget like documentaries and news programs and advertising. You go to a music library where you can license already made tracks because sometimes there's no time to hire someone to create something original, and so you just find the right vibe and you license the piece of music that you need. That might be where AI could kind of come in and disrupt things.
if you use AI and then you get a lawsuit for intellectual property, how safe are you feeling if you're doing that?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's certainly the other concern is if you're a filmmaker or a film studio, you make money by owning and controlling your copyright on your IP, right? So if you're using AI to create any part of that process, then you introduce, and obviously the laws currently are not caught up to what's going on, and perhaps they will soon, but you don't want any gray area of who owns this thing that we made. Because if you use AI and it was trained on data that wasn't properly licensed, you could run into issues there.
Speaking of which, if we take a step back, what should composers know about public domain music and rights?
The main thing is every country has different rules on what's public domain. I think in America it's something like currently, and it changes through the years as they update the law. So depending on when your music was released and what the laws were at that specific time, currently it's something like 95 years after the death of the author is when things will become public domain. And so there's the issue of like, well, it could be public domain in one country, but not in another. So if you're going to release something, but certainly if something's public domain, you're free to use it however you like. So yeah, if you're going to use classical music that's over 100 years old, then you're fine, or some folk song that's existed for centuries.
Okay, so if you're pretty sure Mozart died, hundreds of years ago, you can use that. But if someone died recently, maybe not. What
Or
about
even 50, 60 years ago, you never know. Yeah.
what about licensing for indie or non-franchise content? Do you have experience with that?
Well, certainly there's less money, and so yeah, I mean, if you are doing a big budget studio movie, you might have the budget to go license a Beatles song or Michael Jackson or some hugely popular artist. And of course, the more well-known the artist, the more demand there is for their music, the more they're gonna expect to be paid to allow their songs to be used in your movie. So I should bring up that there's two different rights to licensing music, which is a little bit different from a lot of other things. With music, there's the what's called the well, there's a sync license, which if you want to synchronize a song to an image or video, and that is the license for the composition, the rights to the composition, meaning the actual music that was written. But there's also what's called the master right, and that's the rights to the recording of that composition. So, just, you could take, say, a Beatles song. If you want to license the version performed by the Beatles and recorded by them, that could be expensive. But if you want to save some money, but you still want that song, you could find some indie band or artists doing a cover of the song. And so you could save a little bit of money, at least on the master license. Or you could record your own version and just hire musicians to do that.
So yeah, there's two whole separate things. There's the actual almost intellectual property, and then there's the actual intellectual property of the performance.
Correct. Yeah.
And
so you have to license both. And of course, that can vary wildly in terms of price.
And in a way, if it's old enough, you can play it yourself and then you own it.
Right. But I mean, you would just have to pay the cost of the recording and hire someone to do that.
Now, with public domain IP that's old enough but famous enough, is there a creative opportunity for something like Dracula or Sherlock Holmes?
In terms of music?
Yeah, and composing, you know, putting your spin on it, maybe.
I mean, I don't know that there's like classical music that is specifically attached to something like Dracula. I mean, that's sort of a creative decision of is there a particular reason, like did Dracula come up in a certain area in the 1800s where Mozart or whoever was really popular, and so he listens to that music still, and that is part of that story? Then maybe you could use that public domain music. That's just part of the storytelling process of figuring out what that is.
Okay, great. Now, looking ahead, are there any upcoming projects that you're excited about right now, or anything you could tease to the audience?
So I guess one thing I have coming up this year is we talked about my Star Wars musical parody earlier. I actually produced that, and what it is a sort of 6-minute parody of Star Wars: A New Hope if it was a Disney musical. So I sort of did a mashup of Disney songs and Star Wars tunes. I took songs like A Whole New World from Aladdin and transformed it into a Jedi world. And then we also mashed up the sort of traditional 2D multiplane camera techniques used by Walt Disney in his early feature films, and sort of did hand-drawn versions of the environments in Star Wars, and shot actors on green screen and composited them into this like animated Disney world. So that was a lot of fun. You can go find that on YouTube if you just search Star Wars musical in my name, George Shaw, and you'll probably find it. It has over 500,000 views at this point, but we released that 10 years ago. And 8 years ago, we shot the sequel, which is called Empire's New Groove, and it's a 5-minute spoof of Empire Strikes Back as a Disney musical. And so we're just in the final stages of finalizing post-production, and we'll be releasing that later this year on my YouTube channel.
Wow, that's great. What advice would you give to new composers looking to break into film, especially outside the Hollywood system?
I mean, regardless of where you are, it's sort of the filmmakers that you collaborate with that are going to impact your career. They're the ones who are hiring you, and if they like working with you, they'll hopefully keep working with you as their projects get bigger and bigger. And that's typically how it works for any composer, regardless of being inside or outside of Hollywood. Obviously, being here in LA, there's the industry and there's a lot of filmmakers. I mean, you could probably go to a coffee shop anywhere and someone's working on a screenplay. And so there are those opportunities of just random chance meetings with filmmakers that could turn into something. I once met a filmmaker standing in line at the post office, and we just started chatting, and then he hired me on his movie. Um, but outside of that, I mean, every country kind of has their own local market of filmmaking. There's obviously film festivals all around the world, places where a composer can go to meet up and coming filmmakers, and just forming those relationships is typically what will um, give you the opportunity to succeed as a composer. But obviously, it's also a bit of sort of like winning the lottery when you hit it off with the right filmmaker and they're actually successful enough to bring you along.
Great. And then what do you think makes a film score unforgettable? Is it something like melody, emotion, or orchestration, or something deeper?
I think the most iconic film scores are because of their melody. I'm thinking of stuff like E.T., Star Wars. You play those tunes, everyone knows it. The Avengers theme, James Bond theme, Mission Impossible. You know, just about anyone who's seen movies like will know those tunes, right? And as soon as you hear it, like what it is. So to me, there's nothing more iconic than a melody. Sometimes there's sort of a sound to certain things that it's not the melody, but it's the instruments and the colors of the music that are what people sort of attach to certain things. I mean, that is sort of a little bit more. Uh, I guess in modern days, it's become a little bit more of a thing, whereas in the previous century, there was, I think, melody was the big thing. I mean, then we still have melodies, but I'm thinking about like the Inceptions, the Brahms, the low brass hits that are sort of the iconic part of that sound. Um, but yeah, but to me, end of the day, it's always melody.
Yeah, I think those are the two things for me as well. In your parody, A Jedi World, immediately it lit me up because I went, that's a whole new world. Like I know that
Yeah,
melody. And then when I think about the different big franchises, Harry Potter has that distinct sound, and that's
yeah.
what sets it apart for me. Um, can you name a film where the music stayed with you like a long time after the credits? Does it go back to, I think it was E.T.?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is just the craft of the composer, of creating a melody that's both memorable. That's not easy, but also something that's effective, and the way that you weave it in and out of the score all through the movie, so that when you hit the end, you're like singing that tune, and we get less of that nowadays. But certainly, the way I grew up, that was a big thing, and John Williams is one of the masters of it. And we've talked about so much of his stuff, from all the Spielberg movies to Harry Potter. I mean, he's done some of the most iconic stuff, and that's what inspires me.
Okay, great. Now, is there anything I didn't ask you, but that I should have asked you before before we wrap?
Oh, I don't know. Just want to say, check out my upcoming Star Wars musical. I'll be posting it all over socials once it's out, and yeah, you can find me easily. I'm George Shaw Music on most of the social media websites, and my website as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us today. To everyone watching or listening, thanks for tuning in. You can follow George Shaw. His website's georgeshawmusic.com. YouTube channel George Shaw Music as well, where you can watch the Star Wars musical Disney parody, which has more than 500,000 views, and I really enjoyed as well. So thank you, George. Thank you for listening. And until now, keep listening for the stories between the notes.